Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Jackie. I'm the Head of Communications at iMOVE Cooperative Research Centre. I'm pretty thrilled to bring this topic to you today with our partners from Queensland Government, University of South Australia, CASQ at Queensland University of Technology. Today we're going to be looking at connecting automated vehicles, but focusing on the people side of things. So we've got the results from two of our projects being presented, and we're looking forward to having some discussion with you after the presentations. So first of all, just a bit of housekeeping. If you've got questions, please pop them in the Q&A, which will be at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be answered at the end of both of the presentations. So we'll endeavour to get to those at the end, and if there's anything that we can't answer at that time, then we'll attempt to do some follow-up with you as well. So in order to get things started, I'm very pleased to present to you my peer Max Jamwal from the Department of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland. She's the Principal Advisor to the Connected and Automated Vehicle Initiative and has been closely involved with the communications and public outreach of the programme over the course of the project. So I'd like to hand you over to Max, who will be introducing our speakers, and welcome. Enjoy the webinar. Over to you, Max.
Thank you, Jackie. First up, I would like to introduce Dr. Merle Wood, a principal traffic engineer at the Department of Transport and Main Roads here in Queensland. And with her is Dr. Ioni Lewis, professor at the Centre for Accident Research and Road Safety, which is part of the Queensland University of Technology. If you'd like to share your screen, Ioni and Merle.
Can everyone see?
It's the wrong screen. You've
okay,
got to
all right.
Flip it
okay,
over.
let's unshare that one. Is it better?
That's it. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Max, and thanks, Jackie. And we're very excited to be here this afternoon and to be sharing insights that have been garnered in relation to public attitudes towards vehicle technology that have arisen from projects being undertaken with Queensland's Cooperative and Automated Vehicle Initiative Program, or CAVI, at Queensland's Department of Transport and Main Roads. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners. QUT acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nation owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. QUT acknowledges the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. As by way of a quick overview of all that we will talk about today, myself and Merle, we will highlight findings emerging from two rather substantial bodies of work that have been undertaken through, as Jackie introduced, through the iMOVE-CRC, funded by the Queensland Government, TMR and QUT. So in particular, we're looking at the elements of these projects that have looked at public perceptions and user experience of technology. In the case of the Ipswich Connected Vehicle Pilot, the connected technology, and in the Cooperative and Highly Automated Driving, or CHAD project, the automated technology. Without further ado, I will hand to Merle, who will talk for a little while about the Ipswich Connected Vehicle Pilot.
Yeah, thank you, Ioni. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so maybe some of you were here last year that we had a webinar as well last year, talk about the Ipswich Connected Vehicle Pilot. At that time, we just finished our pilot. We had some preliminary results, and this time we have audit results in, and then we have some insights that we would like to share today. So the pilot itself only take 12 months, but that is years of making. You can see the names, there are a number of names here. I probably won't name that individually, but that's involved all the way from designing the use case, HMI, and also the QT has been involved in managing the participants in a daily basis. And our operations team also make sure the pilot runs smoothly. Today, when I'm talking about the safety evaluation, we have a team of data and safety evaluation team as well. And also QT also have a team to set up this simulator, the driving simulator, to look at the vehicle to vehicle use cases as well. And of course, we have a great support of a bunch of subject matter experts. And I think some of them may be here today. And thank you for joining us today. It's lovely to meet you all today here. So with the Ipswich Connected Vehicle Pilot, we have 3 components for the evaluation. So the driving data collected from the participants used for towards the safety evaluation. And we also have an advanced driving simulator to collect data for the, as I said, the EBOL and the SSV use case, which I'll probably touch on a little bit later. And then the user perceptions and experience are collected from a series of questionnaires, interviews and focus groups, so we can understand the participants' experience and then give us some really valuable feedback. So we've got 2 main research questions that we been working on. The first one is, does the system improve road safety? And that will be demonstrated by the safety evaluation. And the second question is, the system acceptable to drivers? And that will be based on the data collected from the self-reported surveys. Just a quick overview of the pilot itself. So the pilot was in Ipswich. It's about 40 kilometers away from Brisbane, and there are 2 major motorways that connected to it. So we have a 300 square kilometer of virtual cloud coverage over this area. And we have installed 29 roadside stations at our intersections that allow the short range ITS-G5 communications to provide a safety critical messages to the driver. And the main actors was of course the 355 participants. They kindly allow us to install the vehicle stations in their car for 9 months to collect the driving data, and in return they have the experience to use the CITS system as well. So there are 5 use cases that the top 5 ones under the evaluation. And then the last one in vehicle speed is it's on their whole time, and because there's a large number of literature already look at this case study, so we didn't evaluate it, but they were still available for the drivers. So the top 5 is there are 2 about for the traffic signals. So one is for the red light warning, and another one is about the vulnerable road user. So if they are crossing and they also get a green light for the participant, then they will give a warning to tell them to make sure that the pedestrian has finished the crossing before they make the turn. And with the roadwork warnings, mainly for the large roadwork that is there for a little while, like long-term ones. The back of queue is based on the ground detectors on the motorway that pick up where the bottleneck is, and then it sends the data back to our central station, and then we identify how much advance note that we need to give the drivers. And the road hazard warning, it's based on the cumulative traffic feet. Then it tells you when there is a flood or fire or crashes and any other type of road closure ahead. This is just to show the participant mix that we've got, and we were very pleased that the participant we recruit generally represent the Queensland driving population in terms of their age, gender split, and the license type. So with the like the decent sample of representation, then we have more confidence with our analysis. And the participants, to facilitate this comparison, all the participants were given 6 months, 90% of the participants were given 6 months experience to have the safety warning being available. Like, so that's in the blue bars where the HMIs is on. And so that will allow us to collect enough data about their usage, and also their experience can be reflected back in the survey later on. For these participants, we also have the screen turn off, so like blank screen for 3 months. So we collect like their background driving data, so to allow for comparison later on for those statistical modeling. And lastly, 10% of the participants, they were very patient. They didn't have anything on their screen for the whole 9 months, but they just let us to collect their driving data so that we can do any baseline comparison as well. But we thank them by turning on the HMI for the last 2 weeks, so then they can experience that, and we won't log their data for analysis purpose. And this graph is showing that, so generally we find the participants were driving within the pilot area 3 hours per week. This is a requirement when we recruit them, because we want to make sure that they drive enough in the study area, and so then they all their experience or their driving data will be more valid. Of course, there were a couple of holiday period or COVID snap lockdown that prohibited that happen, but generally we were quite pleased with the amount of drivings that the participants have showed us. So this is my last slide. So all these hard work funneled to this quite a few numbers here. So with the roadwork warning, the vulnerable road user and the red lights, they are all showing significant reduction in speed. So when we apply the models, it's converted to a crash reduction rate for their respective type of crashes targeting. We can see that generally like from 3% to 11 or even 22% for advanced red light warning, which is very promising. And then we've got added the simulator study. They also show speed reduction as well. So like the slow stopping vehicle and the EVO, which is electronic emergency brake lights. So they're still very promising as well in a simulator environment. Then when we want to communicate all these results to general public, because these all individual use case, we want to provide them like a cumulative overall crash reduction for the SCQ network. So we have done this factoring. So when we accumulate them all, so with all these use cases, we found that generally we can get about 11% to 20% of crash reduction in terms of fatal and serious injury crashes. So yeah, that's all I've got today. Ioni.
Thanks, Merle. So obviously the safety evaluation based on the driving data has been very confirming and supportive of the important role that the technology and the messaging from the HMI and CITS had played in influencing driver speed and translating into reductions in crashes based on the modelling that Merle's just talked about. Another key and major component of the ICPP, though, was all about understanding the user's experience. So what did the ICPP participants think about the technology and about CITS generally, and did they find it acceptable? And in keeping with the theme of today's topic, you know, obviously this is a critical component for future widespread penetration and adoption of this technology, is that users will want to, and we want to know that people like to use this and see the value and are willing to adopt it. So this was certainly a key component also of the ICBP. So it was quite in and of itself a comprehensive component featuring 3 different self-report methods. So it comprised 4 questionnaires that were conducted with the individual participants over the course of the 9 months of participation, as well as an optional individual interview. And an optional focus group at the conclusion of the pilot. As you can see, that the timeline there gives you an indication of the times at which these different methodologies were implemented. So as I said, the questionnaires were throughout the course of the pilot. The initial questionnaire was prior to the equipment being installed. So we had some important baseline information about what people thought about CITS, etc., right through to them completing at sort of 2, 5, and about 8 months, just over 8 months that they were providing their responses to the final questionnaire at questionnaire 4. The interviews I'll talk about a bit in a moment in terms of their phases, and of course at the end of the trial, and the focus groups at the very end once all the equipment had been removed. So in terms of the questionnaires, for the most part, it was the same questionnaire, the same items that were asked over the 4 time points in the pilot. The measures we used consistent with international literature in this space with technology acceptance. So we're looking at things in terms of attitudes towards the pilot, HMI and the warnings that participants were receiving. We wanted to look at their thoughts about the implications for safety and any impacts on attention and perception that they felt that the messaging had, their experiences more broadly in relation to being in the pilot and the warnings, and relative to the types of warnings that they were receiving. So quite a comprehensive questionnaire and battery of questions we were using to assess their responses to the technology. So in terms of the individual interviews, these were conducted over 3 different phases. So we looked for a cohort of the overall sample. So we ended up with 53 participants who took part in a 10-minute telephone interview. We deliberately conducted these at different phases of the pilot to, of course, capture as the greater experience over time as participants were experiencing the technology for longer time periods, any new and emerging issues and aspects that they wanted to share with us. So each time we conducted the interviews, we also updated the question schedule to ensure we were eliciting any new and yet unexplored insights that may be relevant to our exploration. So we then analysed it through conceptual content analysis, really guided by the questions and the sorts of concepts that were raised in response. And we did conduct a sentiment analysis, which is essentially akin to the vibe. So was it a positive, negative, neutral vibe about their feelings of being involved? The focus groups were conducted online via Zoom. No doubt COVID was involved and had with driving force in the decision for virtual. Again, a cohort of our overall sample participated. We ended up with 47 participants across 14 groups. They were guided by an interview schedule, and we conducted in collaboration with TMR a workshop to identify the sorts of issues and the aspects we wanted to explore further. So in particular, things that we felt, this was essentially our last chance to check in with the participants and find out any additional and new insights that we had yet to explore, as well as this was, as I mentioned before, after equipment removal. So what were people's lives and driving experience like after having the equipment and then having it removed? How had things changed for them? The analysis for this was a thematic analysis. So I'm really pleased to say that while we implemented the 3 different methodologies with intent of being very thorough in uncovering and understanding user perceptions as comprehensively as possible, what we did find was that we found a lot of consistency overall across these different measures, across these different methods, which provided us a lot of reassurance that we were capturing users' perceptions and experiences of the technology. Overall, we were finding participants were positive about the ICVP, the equipment and CITS. We did see, particularly through the questionnaire measures, slight decreases in acceptance associated with HMA use. So as they received warnings that there was some slight decreases, but these still were very much in the high end of the scale. So very much still towards the favourable end of the rating scales that we were using to measure. So as people settled into the pilot and their experience, we anticipate this sort of things leveled out in terms of their acceptance of the technology and their experience. So these expectations were maintained across the 9 months of the pilot, which we found really encouraging again, that people really did settle into and seem to enjoy and be favourable towards having access to this technology in their vehicle. We also found that older adults tended to report greater acceptance than younger adults. And we found that in particular, participants would talk with us and would like to talk with us all day about their experiences of the speed warning messaging. They found that really it would assist them with their driving. They were very positive about that. And that was something that came across consistently in all the 3 self-report studies. We also found that when it came to other warnings, participants were generally positive about those as well. Some had, there were some more mixed experiences and views. So bearing in mind that for some participants, there was relatively infrequent experience of some particular warnings. So road hazard warning being an example. So as Merle said before, like flooding on road and things like that, this was actually a warning that participants didn't experience very often. So they didn't have a lot they could comment on or say about it, having not had that experience to the extent of other use cases or warnings. They did indicate that they would appreciate greater control of the system features. So they'd really like to get in there and adjust the volume to their own personal preference and the screen brightness and things like that. And they would certainly like greater integration of the technology in their vehicle. Of course, this being a pilot, we had to, in this instance, standardise such aspects. So while this is something perhaps to think about for the future, there was very good reason why these aspects were held constant in the case of the pilot. So when we're talking about aspects that participants were really signalling as improvement beyond the pilot and future implementations was really relating to warning timing, and particularly with the red light warning. So that really needing to ensure that timing is as appropriate and matches the context that the driver is in. So this was something that certainly emerged as something for future implementation to be aware of. So the focus groups, so as I said before, they occurred after the equipment was all removed. So a couple of aspects that emerged from the focus groups that were able to be canvassed here that weren't really part of or uncovered in earlier in the questionnaires or interviews was that participants were really supportive of the idea that there's all this information. Could it be used to provide me personalised driving feedback? You know, that would be really beneficial if we could use that to actually give me a report about my driving performance. We also took the opportunity to talk about data sharing and privacy. And again, the participants in the focus groups were believing that data sharing for the purposes of CITS was acceptable, and they could understand that it was necessary for the greater good of contributing to a more optimal system by contributing data. They certainly saw that it was acceptable for road safety and insurance purposes as opposed to marketing or any sort of commercial benefit. So in conclusion, the results supported that there was much enthusiasm of the public participants to participate in such pilots and to engage with this technology. The findings we were very comfortable in supporting suggest that participants and the general public would be very supportive of accepting this technology in the future when rolled out more extensively. So if anyone's interested, there are summary reports about all 3 components of the ICVP, which there is a QR code that you can connect on, and it's also from the iMOVE website. So please feel free to download those if you would like to know more. Now, just one final thing relating to the connected technology before moving on to a very quick overview about results from the CHAD project is just that we also, as a component of work undertaken with TMR, we did evaluate some of TMR's messaging strategy with respect to raising public awareness about connected technology, and this was actually conducted prior to the ICVP, and very positive effects were found with this in terms of increasing people's knowledge about connected technology, as well as increasing their intentions to adopt it in the future. So really important to understand that these messages and resources are achieving their intended goals when communicating with the public about this technology. And this particular study certainly confirmed that the resources were indeed doing that. So changing things just a little. So moving on to the cooperative and highly automated driving project, CHAD. We again are acknowledging a very large team. So I today am talking about what's called Work Package 4 from the CHAD project, which is all about public acceptance and experience of automated technology, but acknowledging that there is a number of work packages that are within the overall CHAD project, and a number of people that make the demonstrations and that make this project possible, both from QUT as well as TMR and the CAVI team. So with big projects like this, many hands on deck to make it possible. So in terms of this particular project, the Work Package 4, all about public messaging and raising awareness about cooperative and automated vehicles. This particular program of research is underpinned by the STEP approach to message design and testing. I won't go into detail of this framework in the interest of time, but the best way to reflect this to you is that the design of the methodology undertaken in developing, testing and evaluating these particular messages that were developed to raise awareness of automated technology were all designed, underpinned by that particular framework with how we go about doing each of these steps in the process. So for purposes of today, just to flag that messaging was developed and that we did show these messages to participants who took part in demonstrations of Zoe 2, the level 4 CAV that you can see on your screen right now. So there was intent that there was two different types of demonstrations of Zoe 2. That included a static demonstration or static demonstrations where their participants don't travel in the vehicle, but the vehicle's there for them to see and look at and get a sense of and talk to the team on site about the vehicle. As well as what we call the dynamic demonstrations, where driving in the vehicle as a passenger, or in some instances, in some of the work packages, being able to have be able to drive, to have that experience of actually being in the vehicle while it's in motion and seeing that happen. So for this particular work package, we did go to these demonstrations and we showed participants the messaging that had been developed, as well as assess their responses to the nature of the demonstration that they were taking part in. So the message concept, steps and levels, it is called. If you're interested, you can access a full copy of it through the QR code there. But essentially, as the name of the concept implies, it was highlighting awareness that we are already well and truly on the journey of extending through the different levels of automation, and making sure people were aware that at different levels of automation, it has implications for what an operator should do at these different levels of automation. So very preliminary findings. It's a final report is being finalised, but these just to give you some indications of where we're at. So using the messaging and the public demonstrations, we're seeing some really positive outcomes in terms of, as you can see the numbers there, in terms of people saying that they would recommend the demonstration to others as a way of increasing their knowledge about automated vehicles. Very high, 96, 98% agreement with that particular question. So stay tuned for more. This is intended as a bit of a teaser. There will be more information to come as these findings are all brought together and finalised. So my final slide, concluding remarks. So clearly what we know is the human in the mix matters. You know, we have this incredible technology in connected and automated vehicles, but of course we have to remember the human who will be using it and interacting with it. And these incredible projects have given the opportunity to explore this in a very meaningful and in-depth way. So what we know at this point in time is that as a general rule, people understand more about what an AV means at a broad level than what they know about connected technology. So the very real need to raise awareness of that connected technology has been important. So we know that the messaging that TMR's CAVI has been disseminating does certainly raise public awareness of and intentions to use that in the future. The ICVP certainly found public enthusiasm and future intent to use the technology when it becomes widely available. And the CHAD Work Package 4 preliminary findings are certainly highlighting some positive effects from the messaging as well as the demonstrations of the level 4 CAV. So I think that's it from us.
Thank you very much, Ioni and Merle. I'll move on to Dr. Akshay, who is an Associate Professor at the University of South Australia Business. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Vij. If you'd like to share your screen and give us a insight into what you've been working on.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Max. Everybody can see the screen. Good. Awesome. So the study, in addition to being funded by the CRC, was also commissioned by the Office of Future Transport Technology out of the Commonwealth Department. There are a number of people involved in the study, some of whom are on the call. So just broadly, what we were interested in was understanding current attitudes, perceptions, and preferences towards CAV technologies, different levels of automation, etc. And then understanding how these attitudes and perceptions are likely to vary across different subpopulation groups, and then if and how government could potentially increase public acceptance. The study had 4 broad stages. For the purpose of this talk, I'll really primarily be focusing on stage 4, which was the centerpiece of the study, where we did a large-scale nationwide survey of roughly 3,000 members of the general Australian population. I will also be relying on findings from the Lit Review to complement some of our own findings, given that there's a lot of work that's happening in this space and that's come out in the last 5 to 7 years. So I'll be blending those into our own analysis. All right, so just to keep the presentation moving briskly, I'll just warm you up with some high-level questions that we asked respondents around their level of familiarity with driverless technology and previous experiences. As one would imagine, given that the technology is still very much under development, the majority report low levels of familiarity. When it comes to experiences, this was interesting. So if you look at the first bar on the left and the chart on the right, around 16% actually reported having sat in a fully automated vehicle as a passenger at least a few times, and of these 4% reported many times, which is surprisingly high given that at this point there are only a handful of trials. That's quite interesting. But then moving straight into perceptions of the technology. So most people agree that driverless technology will have significant benefits for people who currently don't have access to a private car, who can't drive, who can't afford to drive, who don't have a license, have impairments that prevent them from driving, etc. This is just showing a series of ordered statements in terms of their decreasing importance around different benefits that could potentially be realized. And as you can see, mobility for people with driving impairments shows up at top. This is very consistent with other studies in the literature. So this is a previous study from about 4 years ago at this point. Also an Australian study that also found that mobility is the strongest perceived benefit across the population. When it comes to safety, there's obviously some conflict here. So most people understand that the technology can offer long-term benefits by reducing human error by reducing crash risk, etc. But they also understand that the technology is still a ways away from being market ready. And so there are some short-term concerns around whether a machine can safely navigate itself in mixed traffic conditions, how can they handle wildlife, pedestrians, bicyclists, etc., etc. And so that's just showing up in a bunch of different statements. These are statements measuring the salience of different concerns. As you can see, safety is a recurring theme across many of the top-rated statements. At the same time, when we ask them about benefits, as I said, most people do understand that in the long run, these technologies will actually increase safety. But it's obviously a question of how do we manage short-term risk while ensuring that these long-term benefits can be realized. Again, this is consistent with the literature, so I won't dwell on it too much. The third part, various studies, including our own, have tried to assess preferences or perceptions around the impacts of connected and autonomous vehicle technology on other aspects. So will they increase fuel economy? Will they decrease or increase fuel consumption? Will they increase VKT or decrease it? What's the impact on congestion, et cetera, et cetera? When we go out, the impacts seem to vary. When we compared our own findings to the literature, there's not necessarily consistency. So in our case, we found that people do perceive these technologies to be energy saving, but they aren't necessarily sure about the impacts on travel time. But again, as I said, these findings aren't necessarily, there's no consistent trend across the literature. So some studies report greater salience around, say, congestion, others report more concerns around the same, etc. The fourth point around productivity, so a lot of studies, particularly coming out of the private sector, have claimed how driverless cars, by freeing the driver from the task of driving, can free up that time for more productive use. There's a lot of imagery that you might have seen in the public realm of cars with backward seating, backward-facing seats, and people engaging in all sorts of activities other than driving. However, academic studies that have looked into this have often concluded that some of these benefits have been overstated. So when you compare it to how people use their time in existing public transport services, very little of that time is actually on productive activities. This is a previous study from Cunningham et al., where they asked, hey, if you could travel in a driverless car and you didn't have to have your hands on the steering wheel, how would you plan to use that time? And as you can see, doing work activities is third from the bottom, and most of the top-rated activities are indeed non-productive. So in general, impacts on productivity are probably not expected to be as high as perhaps have been claimed, especially in the popular media. Finally, liability is definitely a consistent concern across both our studies. It shows up as the fifth most salient or sixth most salient concern, also shows up in other studies pretty much near the top. So liability is definitely something that needs to be ironed out. And then finally, data privacy. A lot of North American studies have reported concerns around data privacy and data sharing, but Australian studies don't seem to be picking up similar concerns, and that might have to do with cultural differences, where North Americans and Americans in particular are much more concerned about privacy, care much more about individuality, and have less trust in general in public institutions when it can compared to the Australian population. So in the case of Australians, our own study finds data privacy to not be as important. And that's again consistent with other Australian studies where again it ends up at the bottom. All right, moving on quickly then to the next part of the study where we looked at broader consumer preferences for different technologies, levels of automation, but also different service models, given that driverless tech will enable ride sharing and car sharing at much cheaper rates, potentially even more convenient than existing models. And then the question is, what impact, if any, will it have on private car ownership and use? So just broadly, first starting out at just willingness to pay for ownership. So for private ownership, Again, just looking broadly at the literature, a number of studies have looked at the same question. By and large, most find that on average, people are willing to pay about $5,000 to $8,000 more for ownership of a fully automated vehicle over and above a regular car that isn't fully automated, and $3,000 to $5,000 more for partial automation. These are a couple of examples of Australian studies. But despite the consistency in the mean estimates, what is also consistent across these studies is that there is wide heterogeneity across the population. And so you have people at one end of the spectrum that would not pay anything extra for automation. In fact, Cunningham et al. Found that about a quarter of the population would actually be willing to pay less for a fully autonomous car. So they actually prefer to drive the vehicle themselves. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you also have these enthusiasts, anywhere between 5 and 20% of the population, depending on the study and the study context, that are willing to pay significantly more, up to $30,000 more for full automation. This shows up in our own studies. In our study, what we had our survey respondents tell us about a recently made trip. And then for that trip, we said, all right, imagine a situation where you only have these 3 options that offer you access to a partial or fully autonomous vehicle that may or may not come with its own driver or standby chaperone, varies in terms of who you have to share it with, what speeds it can travel at, and the cost of use, etc. And based on this, what we found as well was that there is considerable heterogeneity. So we found 7 segments in our sample population. We've ordered them in terms of increasing enthusiasm or decreasing skepticism towards technologies. And what you find is that you have people at the left who don't want any automation, so 12% of the population in our sample. The less automation, the better. And then you have people at the right side that are very enthusiastic, willing to pay as much as $2 more per kilometer to have access to a fully autonomous vehicle. What's also interesting is that you have these intermediate levels where some people do see value in driver assistance or even partial automation, but don't want to relinquish full control over the machine. Then moving into the shared side of things. So this is, again, casting a broad net, looking not just at our own work, but other studies. What we estimate is that about 25 to 50% of the population is still unwilling to use shared cab services, while 30% potentially could be expected to use these services pretty much all the time if they were available today. And then everybody else falls somewhere between these 2 extremes. Again, I won't go through the laundry list of studies that have looked into this, but for more details, I'll refer you to the original report, which is available on the CRC website. In our own study, I'll just emphasize some of the key findings that we uncovered. What we found was, 1, there is a strong aversion to sharing the vehicle with other passengers that are unknown to the person. And what we found that was even more interesting was because we did a similar study about 3 or 4 years ago before the pandemic. And around that time, what we estimated was that the average Australian is willing to pay about 30 cents per kilometer to not have to share a vehicle. This time we estimate it to be about 60 to 120 cents. So 2 to 4 times what we estimated before the pandemic. I mentioned the pandemic because our hypothesis is that public health risks have obviously increased since the pandemic. People have become more aware of the risk associated with sharing public spaces with other people. That's reflecting in lower public transport patronage. That's also showing up in our study when we compare willingness to use rideshare versus car share services. The other things, so what we found, this is going back to the discussion around productivity, we didn't really find any preference for airplane style seating that would allow you to use that time to do productive work. Conversely, we did find a pretty strong preference for higher speeds. So obviously a lot of the early driverless trials have been operating in closed loop conditions at fairly low speeds. There is obviously a strong willingness to pay of up to as much as 30 cents more to be able to travel faster by 10 kilometers per hour. In terms of geographic and demographic determinants, so we do find this same variables that have been reported by other studies. So in general, people living in metropolitan areas are more likely to adopt these technologies than those living in regional and remote areas. Age and gender tends to be somewhat correlated as well, where younger men are most likely and older women are less likely. But I also want to make the point that there is no consistent trend when it comes to geography and demography. There are always exceptions. So for instance, when you look at how skepticism or enthusiasm correlates with these demographic characteristics, you can always cherry pick examples in that you have women here at the right end that are quite enthusiastic about the technology. And you also have younger people on the left end that are quite skeptical. In general, what we find is it's not so much age, gender, or regionality. It really comes down to the need for the technology and the services. By and large, people who tend to fall to the right are more likely to have higher rates of public transport ridership right now, lower rates of car ownership and licensing, just in general see greater benefits both to themselves and the broader community in terms of mobility and accessibility, whereas people on the left, not so much. All right, I'll probably skip this and I'll just try and quickly summarize the final section. So in terms of looking at the role of government, there's obviously a strong role in terms of public information and education, disseminating findings that are coming out. The previous presentation talked about their own approach to public information. Our own study obviously has identified a number of salient concerns, benefits, and how they correlate with demographic characteristics, etc. That should really offer a wealth of information to marketing campaigns that are seeking to influence behavior and attitudes. This is probably something that is worth talking to. So regulations on testing and trialing. So when we spoke to industry, they indicated that the current government approach is overly cautious and that we should be more risk-taking, more encouraging of innovation. So we thought, all right, that's what we heard from industry. We know government's stance on it. Let's go out and see how public opinion aligns with these two opposing stands. By and large, when we asked, would you support trials, about 78% said yes, which sounds high, but to me, honestly, the surprising part was that 21% outright said no. When you look at how you can again see some of that cautiousness being reflected in the public sentiment, about 60% of people saying we'd like to see them tested on restricted and private environments, relatively low appetite for public testing. This is quite interesting in terms of when about 21% don't again want to see driverless technology ever on Australian roads. And this is going back again to the 21% that don't want them tested on these roads either. We did a stated preference experiment where we said, all right, imagine the government's considering two policies. One policy is more risk-taking, where we'll have these technologies market ready sooner. The others are more cautious. Will impose fewer short-term risks on public safety, but consequently, the technology will not be market ready until later. Which would you prefer? And we used this to come up with a similar matrix of public preferences for testing and trialing. Quickly, what I'll summarize is that 21% on the left, they don't want these technologies ever. They don't want them tested. They don't want them trialed. They don't want them to be available to the general public. 50% are a little bit more rational, but what's interesting is that even this 50% has a zero tolerance for any risk to safety. So they don't want to see any crashes happen because of driverless cars. As long as that can be guaranteed, they're relatively okay with the technology being tested. It's really only about 20-25% that have some appetite for risk-taking. So just to conclude, basically what we find is that the government's current approach is more or less in agreement with the general public, in that both the general public and the government would prefer to see short-term safety prioritized over long-term innovation. I'll probably skip through these last two. They're probably evident to most people. So obviously funding for trials, and then government also has a role to play in managing some of the potential negative impacts of these technologies, both in terms of how they might displace labor, but also how they might impact the transport system itself. I'll just hold this up for a couple of seconds just to summarize, but really I'll hand it back to you, Max, and hopefully we can take some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vidge. Yeah, if you could leave that, I was going to say if you could leave that up so our audience can digest what's on the slide. We do have a couple of questions still open on the Q&A, and this is for the panel holistically, both yourself, Dr. Vidge, and obviously Dr. Ioni and Dr. Merle. How do these findings in your studies compare to similar studies done elsewhere? I know, Dr. Vidge, you've looked at literature reviews across not only Australia, but globally. Dr. Merle, I should say Dr. Wood, but because I know Ioni and Merle.
You just call me Merle.
Merle, in terms of the ICBP pilot, how does the results that we've found from the ICBP pilot similar to ones that have been run, say, in the US or in Europe?
Yeah, because I think we're the only Australian on-road pilot, so we have to look at the C-roads and CX, I can't remember that. So various European pilots to compare their field trial pilots results, and I think generally, well, of course, the methodology may be slightly different, but in general speaking, I think back of queue is a use case that we didn't find any significant reduction in speed, and that is similar to what we saw from the Europe as well. I think partly because of the very dynamic traffic condition that is very hard to measure in the field, and I think the warning is maybe quite subtle, and it's just a warning, and the participant probably can even if a commuter, they probably have already aware of where they usually see bottleneck, and they probably can visually have the cues to slow down. So that is kind of similar, and I don't think we see too many surprise. I think roadwork warning and the in-vehicle speed is always everyone's favorite. And yeah, I think we found a similar thing as well. I'm sure the user perception one is quite encouraging, isn't it? Especially the willingness to pay in the questionnaire that you found.
So there is very much from the user perception side that in studies from overseas that participants are very supportive of the technology and can see the value in it. I think there's always the caveat of, understanding that there'll be maturation as a process for future implementation. So I think that that's certainly something that comes across, is that the concept that participants and individuals are very supportive of the idea of what connected technology can and will offer, and certainly from the ICBP as well as internationally, there is that support for seeing the benefits of what it can offer. So I think that was certainly reflected in other results, and the measures that we used for that very reason, to enable comparability across studies across the globe using those sort of decision making and technology acceptance models that have been applied elsewhere.
Thank you. Now, there's a question that was very similar to a question that I had also thought of from Darren Atkinson. It was around the attitude. It was pretty much worded exactly as I had written it. Do we think attitudes to data privacy may be changing due to more recent events, such as the Optus data breach, in particular shifting from those that you observed through the pilot?
That's a really good question, Max, and I would be lying if I said it hadn't crossed my mind. What would have happened if the pilot was happening right now when the massive data breach occurred with Optus? I think that the participants were certainly very, they were very insightful and informed from the sense that there is certainly risks, and they did talk about the possibility of hacking. I think even one participant went so far as to say that, you know, the idea that they would be able to somehow reverse things and get access to their vehicle. You know, participants were they were talking about these risks and concerns. Their confidence came from the belief that there would be, you know, tight legislation and guidance, recommendations and frameworks around the appropriate use of data and its protection and storage as part of the system. So I think that would certainly be public in part of future implementations. A key component will no doubt be assuring people of the protection of the data that they provide and are sharing to the system to make it optimal. So that's certainly a really important aspect to think about. That it wasn't that participants didn't talk about it pre-Optus breach, what was that, 2 years, 18 months ago, but they were certainly aware of concerns with privacy. But as I said, talking about it from, if it's for road safety and insurance, that's fine, QPS even, but just not commercial and marketing. They would not support that being their data contributing to that.
Thank you very much. I might just shift gear a little bit. Excuse the and I have a question for Dr. Vij here from Julieta. What is the definition of a productive or unproductive activity in reference to what you had mentioned people would be doing in automated vehicles?
Yeah, I mean, we took a very narrow definition. So anything that's work or work related is considered productive, and anything that isn't is considered unproductive. Of course, one can argue that, you know, unproductive work maybe increases the productivity during productive time, etc., etc. And all of that is very valid. It was really just a very narrow focus on whether people will, you know, just be relaxing while they're in the vehicle, or whether that really counts as part of the 9 to 5 is it starts when I enter the vehicle and not when I enter the office kind of mentality. And what we're finding is not really. Most people aren't really yet there where they can see themselves working while on the go.
Thank you. I had one more question from Scott. Have you had any for yourself, Dr. Vij, have you had any discussions with the legal community about just how advanced or otherwise their preparedness is on the matter of law and CAVs being deployed on public roads?
Yes, no, we definitely had a lot of discussions. I'm not a legal expert, so all I know is what I heard, and it may or may not be factually accurate. But by and large, what we heard was that Australia is following the European approach of, you know, placing the legal burden on the testers and the operators up front. And there's a lot more compliance that's required up front to make sure that everything is, you know, up to standard, up to regulation, etc. Whereas the American approach tends to be the opposite. You know, you let them make the mistake, and then all hell breaks loose, and, you know, the gavel of the law comes down, and, you know, so basically the big difference is there's a lot of burden of proof up front in Australia. Whereas in the US, anybody who wants to and believes in their own technology can pretty much go out there and start testing. And it's only in the case that if something goes wrong, that then they get dragged to court. And so, you know, very different approaches.
Yeah, for sure. All right, with that, I am unfortunately going to have to wrap up and hand back to Jackie because we are out of time. So any remaining questions that I can see in the chat or the Q&A session, I will take them on notice and share them with the other panelists so we can answer them and send them out to the people involved. Thank you very much, Jackie.
Thanks, Max. I can't believe we're going to finish a webinar on time. That's unusual, but I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. Just to let you know, there's a whole heap of information that we'll be sharing with you shortly, including slides, the video of the webinar, and links to the relevant projects. So we'll send you an email, or anyone that's registered will get an email about that. I'd also just like to take this opportunity to spruik our upcoming event, because the conversation does not have to finish here. It can continue in November in person. So this is our iMOVE annual conference. I say annual, we haven't run one for a few years because of COVID. We'd love to see you there. The more the merrier to join the conversations. Have a look at the speakers, have a look at the programme. It's going to be really great. So we would love to see you in attendance, and I know that some of you are planning to go already. So with that in mind, I'd just like to say thank you very much for attending. It's been a really interesting session, and we will attempt to follow up on any of those burning questions that we didn't get to. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar or in November in Sydney. So thanks everyone, have a great day. And thanks to all our presenters, you did a fantastic job.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.